The American military command began to consider the use of gliders in airborne operations even before the country entered the Second World War. In 1941, after brief discussions, requirements were drawn up for two types of transport assault gliders. According to these requirements, the first type of glider was to carry 8 to 9 fully equipped soldiers. Contracts for the construction of prototypes to participate in the competition were awarded to the companies Frankfurt, Waco, St. Louis, and Bolus. The second option envisaged a larger aircraft with a cargo passenger cabin for 15 people, which allowed the transport of certain types of military equipment. The same companies undertook the construction of prototypes according to this specification. Interestingly, none of the leading U.S. aircraft manufacturers, such as Boeing, Douglas, or Curtiss, showed interest in building engineless flying machines. Out of 8 projects, only 3 were built and tested, but for various reasons they were rejected by the military department and did not enter serial production. Only 2 prototypes produced by the until then almost unknown company Waco from the small town of the same name in Texas were selected for further refinement. One of them later became the most widely used assault glider of the Second World War. It is now difficult to determine what exactly guided this choice. Perhaps the customer preferred the simplicity and low cost of the design, which was based on the use of non-deficit materials while still providing entirely satisfactory flight characteristics. The glider was intended to carry 15 soldiers with full armament, including 2 pilots. Instead of personnel, it could transport a standard Army Jeep, Ford, or Willys with a load of 550 pounds and 4 paratroopers, or a 75mm howitzer with its crew and several shells, or a 40mm rapid-fire Bofors gun. Any other cargo of suitable dimensions weighing up to 480 pounds could also be taken. The planned towing speed was 137 miles per hour, which made it possible to use transport aircraft as tow planes. The requirement to transport a Jeep largely determined the design of the glider. To load and unload the vehicle, the nose section of the fuselage with the pilot's cabin was made to hinge upward. Aerodynamically, it was a high-wing aircraft with struts. The fuselage frame of rectangular cross-section welded from steel tubes consisted of 3 sections. The nose section was a 2-seat cockpit with pilots sitting side by side. The cabin had hinges at the top and locks at the bottom, which allowed it to be raised upward during loading and unloading operations. To facilitate lifting, a special tubular pyramid was installed on its roof, from which a cable ran into the cargo cabin. By pulling the cable with a hand winch, the cabin could be raised and fixed in the open position. The same pyramid carried the pitot tube for measuring flight speed. The cabin had a large glazed area, providing the pilots with good visibility. The canopy frames were made of duralumin channels. Sliding windows were mounted in the side glazing panels. Sometimes a window was placed in the front glass, and sometimes it was made in the form of a special mushroom. The cabin floor was covered with plywood and the sides with fabric. A tube for creating air suction was attached to the left side. In some modifications, it was located on the roof of the cabin. Plywood pilot seats were attached to the frame, and beneath their feet was a plywood floor. The frame tubes converged in a bundle in the forward upper part of the cockpit. There, the towing lock and brackets for fixing the control columns were located. This same bundle of tubes acted as an anti-nose-over frame, protecting the crew from the cabin collapsing in case the glider overturned during an unsuccessful landing. The middle part of the fuselage was the cargo cabin. It had a rectangular cross-section formed by a tubular frame. The cargo floor was formed by wooden beams covered with plywood from above and below. Fixtures for removable paratrooper seats and lugs for securing cargo were provided on the floor. On the fuselage bottom and sides were brackets for the landing gear, the main wing struts, and the landing skis. In the upper part of the cargo cabin were the wing attachment nodes. Each side contained an entrance door, an emergency hatch, and 4 round windows. Ventilation mushrooms were placed next to the windows. In the ceiling, in the area of the wing's trailing edge, 2 additional light hatches were arranged. All surfaces except the floor and bottom of the cabin were covered with fabric. The tail section of the fuselage was a space frame of rectangular cross-section welded from tubes and covered with fabric. It had fittings for attaching the stabilizer, fin, and tail wheel. The wing had a rectangular shape with rounded tips. It was attached to the upper part of the fuselage and supported by the main V-shaped strut and an additional N-shaped brace. The struts were made of steel tubes, and to improve aerodynamics, the strut tubes were enclosed in fairings consisting of wooden ribs, a trailing edge, and fabric covering. The wing's incidence angle was 1.5 degrees, and the dihedral angle was also 1.5 degrees. The chosen wing profile had a characteristic beak at the leading edge and provided good performance both in gliding flight and when being towed. The wing was entirely wooden. Its structure was based on a main and an auxiliary spar, plywood ribs for stiffness, and plywood skin over most of the surface. Only small sections near the trailing edge and at the wingtips were covered with fabric. There were no landing flaps on the wing, which was explained by the relatively low weight of the aircraft compared to the wing area. Along the trailing edge, ailerons were installed, equipped with balance tabs, and built from an aluminum frame with fabric covering. A small retractable air brake was mounted on the upper surface of the wing. Since landing operations were planned to be carried out not only in the daytime but also at night, a powerful landing light powered by a battery was placed on the leading edge of the left wing. The tail unit followed a classic design consisting of a vertical fin and a horizontal stabilizer. The stabilizer was supported by V-shaped struts and from above by wire bracing. The stabilizer, elevators, and rudder had aluminum frames with aluminum skin along their leading edges, while the remaining surfaces were fabric covered. The control surfaces were equipped with aerodynamic balance tabs and trim tabs. The fin and auxiliary fin were made of a wooden load-bearing frame with plywood skin. The landing gear included main wheels, a tail wheel, and landing skis. The first models had a retractable undercarriage consisting of two main wheels on a common axle that passed under the fuselage. Later, a fixed landing gear was installed. Its strut composed of a V-shaped rocking bracket hinged to the cabin floor, and an oleo-pneumatic shock absorber fixed to the upper part of the fuselage. The main wheels, sized 27 by 8 inches, were fitted with brakes. The tail wheel was self-orienting and equipped with an oleo-pneumatic shock absorber. For some reason, the designers of this aircraft decided to deviate from their declared simplicity and low cost, although they could have easily used a much cheaper rubber cord shock absorber. The wooden landing skis had a 3-layer construction. During operation, the weakness of the landing gear became evident, so the size and number of skis were constantly increased during production. In the first series, only 4 small skis were mounted under the fuselage, but later their number rose to 7, with skis placed not only under the cargo compartment but also in the nose section. To protect the crew during landing from collisions with bushes, trees, and other obstacles, the nose of the glider was significantly reinforced during serial production. Heavy steel tubes enclosed the pilot's cabin and converged at a single point in the front, forming something like a ram. A towing hook was also installed there. This modification became known as the Griswold nose. The control system was of the classic type with cable linkages. In the cockpit, there was a dual control column with round wheels and rudder pedals. Brake pedals were available only for the left pilot. In the first production series, a telephone connection with the tug aircraft was provided through a wire laid along the tow cable. However, since the wire often broke during flight, this connection was considered unreliable, and radios began to be installed on the glider. And this was for a single flight. It is worth noting that in the Soviet Union at that time, radios were not even installed on all combat aircraft. Clearly, the concepts of simplicity and low cost were understood somewhat differently in the Soviet Union and the United States. The radio, like the landing light and onboard instruments, was powered by a battery. The flight and navigation equipment included an airspeed indicator, a variometer, a turn and slip indicator, an altimeter, and a compass, which theoretically made it possible to perform independent flight after release, and to land only during the day and in simple weather conditions. Nevertheless, despite this limited set of instruments, glider pilots during combat operations often managed to land their machines even at night. The prototype glider first took off in May 1942. It quickly passed tests and was accepted for service. The government issued an order for large-scale production. The small Waco company could not fulfill the order alone, so it involved at least 16 subcontractors, many of which had never before engaged in aircraft production. Of the 13,916 gliders built between 1942 and 1945, the main contractor, Waco, produced only 175. Most of them were assembled at Waco of Troy's factory, located in a small town with the loud name Troy in the state of Ohio. The rest were produced by partners. Among the largest were Commonwealth, which built 1,370 units, General Aircraft, which built 1,012, and Northwestern Aeronautical, which built 1,510. In 1945, an order was issued for another 5,190 units, but it was canceled due to the end of the war. Of course, in the course of production by different firms, small changes were introduced into the glider's design, but Waco strictly monitored compliance with the main technical parameters. The glider had good aerodynamic qualities and a low weight relative to wing area. This provided good soaring ability, stability, and ease of control. When landing, the glider approached the ground at a shallow angle, which lengthened the landing roll and increased the likelihood of collisions with ground obstacles. If the pilot tried to press the aircraft to the ground, it approached the landing site at too high a speed, which also increased the risk of an accident. To increase the glide angle, air brakes were installed on the upper wing surface, which were extended before landing. However, the brake lever in the cockpit was placed awkwardly, sometimes causing accidental deployment. In addition, extended air brakes caused some instability during landing. In addition, as it turned out, the area of the braking devices was insufficient, so on some late series of gliders, an additional braking parachute was installed. It was also released before landing. As a result, the glider approached the ground along a steep trajectory, and immediately before touchdown it was jettisoned, after which an ordinary landing run was performed. The landing speed in this case did not exceed 50 miles per hour. Towing was usually performed on a single cable, that is, one glider behind one tug. The relatively small takeoff weight of the Waco made it possible for one aircraft to tow two gliders at once. In this case, they flew side by side, which required from their pilots special skills and extreme attentiveness. To reduce the risk of collision, one of the cables was made longer, so the gliders flew behind the tug not wing to wing, but in echelon, one approximately 30-50 feet behind the other. However, during operations in Burma and Germany, where this towing method was used, several mid-air collisions occurred with loss of life. The maximum towing speed, as already mentioned, was 137 miles per hour, but sometimes it was exceeded, which threatened to break the cable and could damage the structure of the glider. The standard tugs were American transport aircraft. In the British Air Forces, the Armstrong-Whitworth Albemarle bomber was usually used as a tug, but for it, such a speed was too low, which led to pilot fatigue and frequent cable breaks. Difficulties also arose during loading and unloading operations. For example, a loaded Jeep occupied almost the entire volume of the fuselage, greatly complicating the passage of pilots to the cockpit. After all, they had to enter through the rear door, then climb over the vehicle, and only then take their places. In the case of a hard landing, which happened often, the hinged nose was frequently jammed. Then, it was impossible to unload large cargo, since the glider was not designed to jettison the tail as the British Horsa glider could. Sometimes it came to the point where soldiers literally had to break apart the nose cabin in order to roll a jeep, trailer, or gun out of the fuselage. Instead, a system was developed for the glider to be snatched from the ground without the tug landing. If the glider did not receive damage during landing, this system made it possible to use it multiple times, as well as to evacuate the wounded and crews from the landing site. A special elastic cable was attached to the glider, the front part of which was made as a loop. The loop was suspended in front on two poles 16-20 feet high. Under the fuselage of the aircraft, a hook with a latch and a cable was fixed. A special braking winch on the aircraft served as a device for damping jerks and oscillations. During the snatch, the aircraft flew over the poles and hooked the rope loop with the hook. At the same time the latch worked, fixing the catch, the tow cable unwound from the aircraft, and the winch braked it while the glider performed a takeoff run. After the glider took off, the same winch reeled in the excess cable, and the further flight proceeded in the usual manner. This system was successfully used during combat operations in Burma. During production, work continued on improving the glider. One subcontracting company, Tim Aircraft Corporation, in 1943 built an all-wooden version of the Waco, from the design of which metal was almost completely excluded. But this idea did not receive further development. A more radical modernization was carried out by the Waco company itself. Having studied the experience of glider use, it created an improved version. On the new model, the wingspan was reduced, which made it possible to increase the towing speed. And in order to reserve an acceptable landing speed, the wing was equipped with flaps. The pilot's cockpit received separate entrance doors, and the landing gear improved shock absorption. The glider went into series production, and by the end of the war, 427 units had been built. Repeated attempts were made to equip the Waco with engines. Thus, the Northwest Aeronautical Company built 4 motor gliders. Under each wing panel, a Franklin engine with a power of 128 horsepower was suspended. It was assumed that after completing the mission, a lightened glider without cargo would be able to take off independently and return to base on its own. But the engine power turned out to be insufficient, so on the production version, well-cowled Ranger radial engines of 199 horsepower each with 2-bladed propellers were installed. Only 10 such gliders were built. The Redfield and Ford companies also built 1 motor glider each with the same engines, but their developments were rejected. The Americans also offered the glider for purchase and licensed production to their British allies, but the British at that time had an almost ready larger capacity glider, the Horsa. Therefore, the British bought only 1062 units, which were used in cases where there was no need to transport heavy cargo, for example, in reconnaissance and sabotage operations. The British, faithful to the tradition of giving all flying machines their own names, assigned the glider the name of the ancient Roman emperor, Hadrian. Starting from 1943, gliders were actively used both in Europe and in the Far East. But the first event that made it famous was the record flight of the Waco across the Atlantic. The purpose of this operation was to deliver the glider to the British for familiarization, and at the same time to transport a cargo of medicines, radio components, and spare parts for aircraft to Iceland and Scotland. The cargo, weighing 30-50 pounds, was placed on 3 pallets. For insurance, the glider was equipped with inflatable bags, which were supposed to provide buoyancy in case of an emergency landing on water. On June 23, 1943, a tug aircraft and a transport glider took off from the Canadian Dorval Air Base near Montreal. That same day, they reached the northern coast of Labrador. On June 27th, the pair flew to the intermediate airfield Blue West 1. 3 days later, the first phase of the transatlantic flight began. After 7 hours 15 minutes, the glider and tug aircraft reached Iceland. There, 2 of the 3 cargo pallets were unloaded from the glider, and the pair departed for the second part of the transatlantic journey. On June 30th, the crews safely landed at Prestwick Air Base in Scotland. Thus ended the first ever flight of an engineless aircraft across the Atlantic. The total flight time was 28 hours. In real combat, American assault gliders were first used during the Sicilian landing operation. Due to low training levels and poor coordination, the debut proved disastrous. On the night of July 9, 1943, 136 gliders took off from field airstrips in Tunisia and headed for Sicily. The final destination was the strategically important Ponte Grande Bridge, which was to be seized by airborne troops. Even on approach to Sicily, the formations encountered dense anti-aircraft fire and blinding searchlights. It later turned out that the fire came from American and British naval ships, which mistook the assault force for enemy bombers. To avoid unnecessary risk, the tow planes released their gliders several kilometers offshore. As a result, 69 gliders failed to reach the shoreline and landed in the water. 7 of them are still listed as missing along with their crews, and the total number of missing, that is, effectively drowned, airborne troops was estimated at 207 men. Most of the other gliders landed anywhere but near the target, with many crashing into trees and stone fences. Only 3 gliders out of 136 landed in the immediate vicinity of the bridge. Nevertheless, the surviving American soldiers, together with their British comrades who had landed in Horsa gliders, quickly seized the bridge, which was almost unguarded. But 2 hours later, the Italians regrouped, launched a counterattack, and retook the bridge with little effort. The total number of killed, wounded, and missing airborne troops and glider crews during this operation reached 600. The goal of another operation, codenamed Fustian, was to seize the Primosole Bridge near the Sicilian city of Catania. For this, it was decided to use a parachute glider landing force, which included not only paratroopers but also 8 American gliders and 11 British Horsa gliders. On July 12th, the formations took off from Tunisia. 2 tow planes with American gliders had to return due to technical failures, and 3 more fell victim to anti-aircraft fire. All the other American gliders, as well as 7 British ones, crashed during landings. Only 4 detachments of British paratroopers who landed in the area of the bridge managed to complete the mission. American gliders showed themselves more successfully at the opposite end of the world from Europe, in Burma. Back in 1942, the Japanese had occupied this British colony, driving out the British. But in 1943, the Chindits, British colonial troops, mostly recruited from the local population, under the command of General Wingate, began active counter-operations. Taking advantage of the absence of a continuous front line and the difficult terrain, they carried out deep jungle raids into Japanese rear areas, conducting sabotage, attacking garrisons and transport columns, in short, waging guerrilla warfare. In January 1944, the British planned the largest of such operations. In total, more than 20 battalions of Chindits were to penetrate into central Burma and destroy railway communications there, spreading chaos and panic. Their deployment was to be carried out by air, and this task was assigned to the American Air Group under Colonel Philip Cochrane, which included transport aircraft and gliders. The operation received the code name Tuesday. It began with the deployment of parachute groups, which cleared several landing sites for the gliders in the Burmese jungle. In total, there were 6 such sites: Piccadilly, Broadway, Aberdeen, Whitetown, Blackpool, and Chowringhee. And they were located very far apart. The distance from the closest to the front line, Blackpool, to the farthest, Chowringhee, was nearly 124 miles. Construction of improvised airstrips was completed in early March, but the first glider landed in Japanese rear territory as early as February 28th. It delivered 17 British commandos with orders to destroy an enemy communications hub. And although the landing, as usual, was unsuccessful and 3 paratroopers were wounded, the rest successfully carried out the mission. The main phase of Operation Tuesday began on March 5th. In the evening of that day, 44 British and 39 American transport aircraft took off from the Indian air bases Lalagat, Hailakandi, and Tulihal. Some carried paratroopers, while others towed assault gliders. Some had to tow 2 gliders at once with double cables, even though neither their crews nor the glider pilots had been trained for this. As a result, several cable breaks occurred and 2 gliders collided in midair. In total, 80 gliders participated in the operation. The largest landing was planned at Broadway. 61 gliders were directed there, but during the nearly 4-hour flight, 9 returned due to technical problems with their tow planes, 8 broke loose from their cables and landed somewhere in enemy rear areas, and several more crashed in the jungle just short of the runway. Nevertheless, at the Broadway airfield, 37 gliders successfully landed, delivering 539 soldiers and officers, 3 mules, and nearly 30 tons of various supplies, as well as construction equipment to transform the narrow jungle clearing into a full-fledged airfield. Only 3 aircraft crashed while landing directly at Broadway, killing 2 and injuring 35 paratroopers. Compared to last year's landings in Sicily, this result could be considered excellent. The paratroopers immediately began building a runway 5,250 feet long, on which already the following night 12 transport aircraft landed, bringing various cargo and evacuating the wounded. Another group of aircraft and gliders headed on March 5th to the site of the expected crossing of British troops over the Chindwin River. There, 6 gliders landed with soldiers who established a checkpoint. The next day, March 6th, 12 gliders flew to the Chowringhee site. Taking into account the negative experience of the previous landing, this time only single towing was used and the intervals between formations were increased. One of the gliders carried a small bulldozer for building the airfield, but this miracle of technology never got the chance to be tested. During landing, the glider crashed and the bulldozer was destroyed. But already the following day, March 7th, another 4 gliders landed at Chowringhee, and one of them finally delivered the precious micro-bulldozer. Just 4 hours later, the new runway was completed and the first transport aircraft was able to land on it. 6 undamaged gliders that had landed at Chowringhee were evacuated by snatch pickup and later reused. Interestingly, the pilot of one of them was the popular American film comedian Kid Jackie Coogan, who before the war had starred in several films with Charlie Chaplin. On March 21st, 6 gliders successfully landed at the Aberdeen site carrying bulldozers, military engineers, and equipment to create a runway. The next day, all of them were also picked up and returned to base. It should be noted that all these landings at first took place without any opposition from the Japanese. But eventually, the enemy realized what was happening, brought up reinforcements, and launched a counterattack. On March 23rd, at the White City site, 5 gliders landed with ammunition. At that moment, a battle was raging on the approaches to the airfield with a large Japanese detachment trying to seize it. Shells and mortars exploded on the airstrip. Bullets whistled through the air, but 3 gliders were quickly unloaded. Then wounded men were loaded into them, and transport aircraft, called in by radio, snatched them from the ground and towed them back to base. The other 2 gliders were struck by artillery fire. That same day, 4 gliders landed in the middle of the water, on a sandy shoal of the Irrawaddy River, unloading inflatable motorboats. With their help, the Americans organized a ferry crossing that facilitated the Allied troops' passage across the river. Later, one of the 4 gliders was evacuated by snatch pickup. On March 25th, under Japanese pressure, the British had to evacuate from the Broadway airfield, and later from the Aberdeen and Chowringhe sites as well. But the remaining jungle airfields continued to operate. On May 17, 1944, Chinese troops under the command of American General Stilwell, who had launched an offensive in northern Burma, captured the Japanese airfield Myitkyina. The Japanese counterattacked incessantly, and the general realized that without reinforcements he could not hold out. But troops could be quickly transferred only by air, and the airfield, due to its small size, could not receive transport aircraft. Then the glider troops again came to the rescue. On the morning of May 1810, gliders landed on the airstrip with military engineers and equipment. Although 8 of them crashed and several pilots and passengers were killed, the surviving engineer soldiers immediately began clearing trees, widening and lengthening the runway. And in the evening of the same day, the first transport aircraft with Chinese infantry landed on the renewed Myitkyina airfield. The Japanese counterattacks were repelled. Meanwhile, at the end of May, the period of torrential monsoon rains began, which for a long time halted combat operations. It was time to take stock. The Americans and the British evaluated the results of the glider operations in Burma very positively. The engineless aircraft proved to be the optimal means of delivering everything necessary for the construction of airfields in enemy rear areas, as well as for supplying troops and partisan formations operating behind the front line. And the possibility of snatch pickup from the ground made them also a good means of evacuation. The highest point of the glider's combat career was the famous Operation Overlord, the landing in Normandy, which opened the second front in Europe. In the first 2 days of this operation, 292 gliders were employed, which landed in the enemy's rear near the towns of Sainte-Mère-Église, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and Le Forge, the troops of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The 82nd Division was dropped in 4 groups under the code names Detroit, Elmira, Galveston, and Hackensack. The first group, Detroit, consisted of 52 gliders directed to its designated area located northwest of Sainte-Mère-Église. Trouble began soon after takeoff. 7 gliders over the English Channel broke away from their tow planes. Crews and passengers of only 2 of them were found and pulled from the water. The rest disappeared without trace. As soon as they appeared in the drop zone, the formations came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. 1 tow plane was shot down. Of the surviving 44 gliders, only 23 managed to land in the designated square. The rest were scattered throughout the area, and 2 machines crashed into buildings in Sainte-Mère-Église. Many others were wrecked during landings. In the process, 3 men were killed, 23 were wounded, and a large part of the equipment was destroyed, including 11 of 20 jeeps and 8 of 16 anti-tank guns. The second group, called Elmira, was mixed. It included 22 American gliders and 54 British Horsa gliders with American crews. The Germans met this group with powerful anti-aircraft fire. Within seconds, they shot down 2 Douglas tow planes, and the rest hastily began to release their gliders, thinking only about how to get out of the danger zone as quickly as possible. No one remembered the designated landing site anymore. The glider pilots tried to land their machines anywhere, on any more or less suitable ground. In this situation, the relatively small and light American Waco gliders turned out to be in a more favorable position than the heavy British Horses, which required a much longer landing run. About half of the American gliders landed successfully, the rest crashed. Among the British gliders, the number of completely destroyed machines reached 80%, but the sturdy and well-thought-out construction of the gliders saved the lives of the crews. The number of dead was comparatively small, 5 pilots and 5 passengers. The third wave of landings, called Galveston, started in the morning of the second day of the operation. It included 68 British Horsa gliders and 82 American Wacos. To reduce losses from anti-aircraft fire, the tow formations flew to the target at extremely low altitude, from 200 to 330 feet, and at the same altitude the gliders were released. Thus, the glider pilots controlled their aircraft independently for no more than 30 seconds, during which they had to orient themselves and land. Obviously, they had neither the altitude nor the time to choose a suitable landing ground. For many of them, this short 30-second flight, more like a fall, remained the only combat sortie of their lives. Once again, the American Wacos proved more flight-worthy and safer than the British horses. Of the 68 British gliders, 10 crashed completely, burying 17 people under their wreckage, and another 7 machines were seriously damaged. Of the 82 American gliders, only 9 crashed and there were no fatalities on them. The final part of the operation to deliver the 82nd Airborne Division to the French coast, named Hackensack, began 2 hours after the completion of Galveston. 70 American Wacos and 30 British horses transported elements of the 325th and 401st Regiments, as well as 20 jeeps, 13 light field howitzers, 6 tons of ammunition, and 18 tons of various military equipment. On the edge of their landing zone, fighting with the Germans was still going on, and they did not miss the opportunity to fire with every available weapon at the gliders coming down. They did not manage to shoot down a single one, but far more dangerous enemies for the glider crews turned out to be houses, poles, trees, and the earth itself. 19 British gliders crashed, 15 soldiers and 2 pilots killed, and 13 American Wacos, 2 killed. Only 4 of the British gliders landed undamaged compared to 42 of the American ones. 2 jeeps were also destroyed. The 101st Airborne Division landed simultaneously with the 82nd, but not in 4 waves, rather in 2. The first landing group was called Chicago. It consisted of 52 American gliders carrying 158 soldiers and officers, 16 anti-tank guns, jeeps, ammunition, and equipment. They were to land in the morning of the first day of the operation, a few kilometers west of the town of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The formations took off at night. Over the English Channel, they came under friendly fire from Allied naval anti-aircraft guns, which shot down 1 tow plane. The rest reached the target successfully. At the moment of release, the moon hid behind clouds, and the earth was covered in complete darkness, broken only for a few dozen yards by the yellow beams of landing lights. The glider crews had to land literally by touch, and the entire area below them consisted of tiny fields lined with poplars, surrounded by stone fences and interspersed with farmhouses. It is not surprising that in such conditions not a single glider escaped damage, and several machines were completely destroyed. 15 people were killed, including the division commander himself, Brigadier General Don Pratt. The American Waco glider he was flying in was piloted by one of the best glider pilots in the United States, multiple record holder Lieutenant Colonel Murphy. He did everything he could to save his own life and the lives of his passengers, but when already during the landing run on slippery grass wet with dew, a brick wall suddenly loomed out of the darkness right in front of the nose of the glider, all his skill and experience proved powerless. Don Pratt became the first American general killed in Normandy. The second landing group, called Keokuk, consisted of 32 British Horsa gliders, which carried staff personnel, medics, technical personnel, as well as 40 jeeps, 6 guns, and 19 tons of various supplies. Losses in this group were also significant. 14 people were killed in the wrecked gliders, 30 were wounded, and 10 went missing. In total, during the first 2 days of Operation Overlord, American glider crews delivered 4,021 soldiers and officers, 290 vehicles, several dozen guns, and 238 tons of equipment and ammunition to the European continent. The airborne troops attacked German forces from the rear and cut their supply lines, which greatly eased the task of those landing on the Normandy beaches under heavy fire from the sea. Human losses during the landings of the 82nd and 101st Divisions amounted to 463 killed and missing, to which must be added 25 killed and 50 missing glider pilots. These figures do not include the losses of airborne troops in the subsequent intensive ground fighting after the landing. I want to emphasize again that among the crews and passengers of American Waco gliders, the percentage of losses was much lower than among the British horses. Thus, the American glider proved more humane, while the British one was more spacious and load-bearing, and as is well known, everything has a price. In war, this price is often paid in human lives. The next major operation involving Waco gliders was the Allied landing on the Mediterranean coast of France under the code name Dragoon. For this, a troop group was formed consisting of the 2nd American Airborne Brigade and a battalion of glider-borne troops with a total strength of 2,700 men. Early in the morning of August 15, 1944, 75 Douglas transport aircraft took off from southern Italy, towing 40 American gliders and 35 British Horsa gliders. When the formation was already flying over Corsica, the commander of the operation, American General Williams, received a weather report for the landing area. The weather turned out to be poor. The ground was covered with dense fog. Under such conditions, the general considered the landing of heavy horses, with their long ground run, too risky, and ordered the aircraft towing them to turn back. But he trusted the Wacos more and did not give them the same order. The 40 tows continued their flight toward the target. 2 gliders, for unknown reasons, broke away from their tow planes and landed on the water. The crew and passengers of one were rescued by an American ship passing nearby, while the second was never found. Another pair had to turn back due to engine problems on their tow plane. The long journey across the Mediterranean for the remaining 37 pairs lasted 4 hours, but when they finally crossed the coastline and reached the designated sector, the white mist was still swirling above the ground. However, all signs indicated that it would soon clear. The tow planes still had fuel reserves, and they decided to wait. For almost an hour, the transport aircraft with gliders circled in the sky until the fog melted away under the rays of the hot summer sun, and the ground below became clearly visible. Only then were the tow cables released. It is unclear where German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery were during all this time. After all, defenseless transport planes and gliders would have been a perfect target for them. Or perhaps in southern France, the Germans simply had nothing left to repel the Allied airborne invasion. Be that as it may, the landing operation went as if it were an exercise. No one fired at the gliders. 34 out of 37 landed safely and precisely in the designated area. 3 others landed a little further away, but also without major incidents. Together with the paratroopers who had been dropped earlier, the glider troops easily seized the bridges over the Argens and Nartubi rivers, which were the main objectives of the first stage of the operation. And a few hours later, reinforcements arrived in the Horsas, which had returned, refueled, and flown out again. They were followed by the main wave of the landing, 332 Waco gliders in 7 groups, flying one after another with intervals of 8 to 9 minutes. They transported over 2,000 soldiers, 25 guns, 166 vehicles, and a large quantity of other military cargo. One of the largest glider landings conducted by the American Army during the war passed without the slightest resistance from the enemy, but not without losses. In accidents, 11 pilots were killed and 30 were wounded. There were at least 100 wounded among the troops as well. Most of the pilot fatalities occurred due to collisions during the landing run with various ground obstacles, primarily trees and stone walls. It was after this incident that all series-produced Wacos began to be equipped with a reinforced metal nose and a braking parachute. The largest Allied operation in terms of glider use during the Second World War took place in September 1944 in the Netherlands and was codenamed Market Garden. It also became the most difficult and bloody battle of the war for the American and especially the British airborne troops. The mission of the airborne forces was to capture bridges over the Rhine and hold them until the arrival of the main ground forces. The United States engaged the already familiar 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which had rested and replenished their losses suffered in Normandy. The British used primarily their own Horsa and Hamilcar gliders to transport troops, while the Americans used Wacos. On September 17th, the first day of the operation, after massive aerial bombardments of German anti-aircraft positions, an armada of 478 tow planes with gliders took to the sky, 50 of which belonged to the 82nd and 70 to the 101st Division. The landing site for the 101st Division was designated Zone W, and for the 82nd, Zone N and Zone T. At 13:48, 70 American gliders landed at Zone W, unloading 43 jeeps, 18 trailers, 301 soldiers, a communications platoon, a reconnaissance platoon, a medical company, as well as the commander of the 101st Division, General Taylor, with his staff. The The remaining 50 Wacos landed at the nearby Zone N, delivering an anti-tank battery with 8 guns, ammunition, and personnel, 9 jeeps, and 2 trailers. As usual, several gliders crashed during landing, but overall the losses were assessed as minimal. The next day, the operation reached its peak. On September 18th, no fewer than 904 glider tow pairs took to the air at once. 450 tow planes with gliders headed for Zone W. Despite the previous day's Allied airstrikes, which theoretically should have silenced the enemy's anti-aircraft guns, the Germans opened heavy fire and shot down 6 tow planes. Many others had to release their gliders prematurely, forcing them to land before reaching the target. A total of 385 gliders reached the designated zone, delivering 1,782 soldiers out of 2,656, 177 jeeps, 60 artillery pieces, and a group of officers led by Brigadier General McAuliffe. 45 men inside the gliders were killed in the air or severely wounded by fragments of anti-aircraft shells. 454 American military gliders flew toward the landing zones. They were met by intense anti-aircraft fire. 4 tow planes were shot down, one of them exploding in mid-air. 3 gliders were seriously damaged and were forced to make emergency landings wherever they could. Several more gliders broke away from their tow ropes and also crash-landed. Yet 429 glider crews honorably fulfilled their orders, delivering 2,579 soldiers, 146 military jeeps, and 109 trailers to the drop zone. From the cockpits, 36 men wounded by anti-aircraft fire were carried out, while another 51 crew members and passengers of gliders that landed somewhere in enemy territory were listed as missing. On September 19th, another 385 gliders, despite poor weather conditions, flew toward the next landing zone. Strong winds shook the gliders and tore tow ropes. In addition, the Germans again staged a warm welcome for the glider pilots, putting up a solid curtain of anti-aircraft fire. As a result, only 210 of the 385 gliders reached their target and landed more or less successfully. The number of American glider pilots and paratroopers killed that day was 28, while 225 were missing in action. This became a kind of grim record. Even the experienced veterans of Operation Overlord could not recall such one-day losses. Of the 2,310 paratroopers who took off on September 19th, only 1,340 landed at the designated site, more than 40 of them wounded. The command realized that suppressing the German anti-aircraft defenses had failed and that the losses exceeded all acceptable limits. On September 23rd, the last landing assault of the operation took place. 84 gliders arrived in the landing zone with 395 soldiers, 12 tons of ammunition, 15 guns, and 23 jeeps. Another 406 gliders delivered to the site units of a regiment, an anti-tank battalion, as well as a command platoon, a reconnaissance platoon, and 2 engineering detachments. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Allies' situation was far from brilliant. Although American paratroopers from 2 airborne divisions managed to link up with ground forces advancing from Belgium, more than 8,000 soldiers and officers of the British Airborne Division and the Polish Parachute Brigade landed near the Dutch city of Arnhem, were trapped in a tight encirclement by German tank units. The Allies never managed to break through to help them. On the night of September 26th, about 2,500 Englishmen, abandoning the wounded and their military equipment, broke out of the encirclement. The rest were either killed or taken prisoner. The bridges over the Rhine near Arnhem, the main objective of the operation, remained in German hands. In October, the English carried out an airborne operation in Greece under the code name Mara. Its aim was the occupation of Greek territory, from which German troops, threatened with being cut off by the advancing Soviet army, had just evacuated. On October 15, 1944, 20 gliders, departing from the Italian city of Bari, arrived in the Greek port city of Megara. Each carried either a jeep or a gun with 6 artillerymen, and 1 glider transported a bulldozer. This equipment was intended to support British paratroopers who had been dropped there 3 days earlier in case they had to fight with Greek communist partisans seeking to establish their power in the country after the Germans' departure. After a large-scale British naval landing, the goal of the operation in Greece was achieved. A pro-British bourgeois government under Prime Minister Papandreou came to power. However, a month later, civil war broke out in Greece. The communists tried to achieve their goal by force of arms. Street battles broke out in Megara and other Greek cities. there was a danger that British gliders could be captured right on the airfield. The British then recalled their Burmese experience and evacuated them by towing with planes flying overhead, pulling them back to Italy. In mid-December 1944, German forces launched on the Western Front, the last large-scale offensive operation of the war, which entered history as the Battle of the Ardennes. The Americans, who bore the brunt of the attack, were taken by surprise. The front was broken, and separate American units found themselves in complete or partial encirclement. The Airborne Division, holding the defense near the Belgian city of Bastogne, also found itself in a difficult situation. The Germans managed to cut off the division's supply lines, seize part of its rear services, and even capture the divisional hospital. It was decided to supply the paratroopers by a proven method, with gliders. On December 26th, 11 gliders flying from France delivered 15 tons of supplies and a team of volunteer doctors to those defending Bastogne. Upon landing, the gliders came under heavy anti-aircraft fire, which killed 7 of the doctors in their cockpits. The next day, 50 gliders flew to the encircled division with fuel and ammunition. On the way, they were subjected to anti-aircraft fire and attacks by interceptors, which inflicted a true massacre on the Americans. 15 tow planes were shot down. Their gliders had to land somewhere in enemy territory, and the crews of those gliders added to the grim statistics of the missing. 2 more tow planes were shot down by the Germans on the return journey after releasing the gliders. Still, 35 gliders landed near Bastogne, delivering 50 tons of supplies and another team of doctors. Soon, the Americans managed to restore ground communications with Bastogne, and the risky glider flights there ceased. The last major airborne operation of the Allies in World War II took place at the end of March 1945. It was named Varsity. In this operation, British and American paratroopers landed by parachute and in gliders on the eastern bank of the Rhine to seize a bridgehead and thereby facilitate the crossing of the river by amphibious units. According to the Allied command plan, nearly 1,350 gliders were to take part in the airborne operation. 860 Waco, in fact 798, 440 Horsa, and 44 Hamilcar, as well as 1,050 tow aircraft. Since fewer aircraft than gliders were gathered, a significant number of Waco crews had to fly in pairs, 2 gliders per tow plane. The operation began on the night of March 24th at 2 o'clock in the morning, when from dozens of French airfields, a huge armada of American and British fighters, bombers, and tugs with gliders rose into the air. While the bombers, covered by fighters, attacked German defensive positions and anti-aircraft batteries, the connections of tugs and gliders moved slowly toward their targets. 592 gliders, assigned to land in the so-called S-zone, north of the town of Wesel, flew in pairs. They carried 3,492 soldiers of the 17th Airborne Division, 202 jeeps with 94 trailers, as well as guns and ammunition. The remaining Waco gliders headed for the N-zone, near the town of Hammenkeln, and were towed singly. As in Arnhem, the bombers failed to silence the German anti-aircraft guns. Approaching Wesel, the paratroopers met such heavy fire that, according to the pilots, they had not seen anything like it throughout the war. 12 tow planes were shot down, many others were damaged. 83 gliders broke away from their tows and several collided in the air, but the rest still reached their targets and landed the troops in the designated areas. The paratroopers, as planned, captured a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine and held it until 3 p.m., when the forward units of the American Army crossed the river on self-propelled landing barges and amphibious vehicles. By evening, the crossing of the Rhine was successfully completed. The Allies had overcome the last major water obstacle on their way to the heart of Germany. For a short time after the war, transport assault gliders continued to be produced in the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain, but as helicopter technology developed, their role gradually faded. Yet at the time, the assault glider played a major role. After all, there was no other more or less reliable way to deliver heavy, oversized cargo to the landing zone. But it was also a rather dangerous method. The loss rate with parachute landings in World War II averaged 2%, while with glider landings it was 4%, twice as high. However, glider landings achieved greater accuracy as well as tighter troop concentration. By the end of the war, the Americans and British had managed to ensure that almost 90% of gliders landed at the designated point or in its immediate vicinity. Paratroopers, on the other hand, were often scattered by the wind for many kilometers, and only half of them landed near the intended points. Be that as it may, the assault glider proved itself well during the war and inscribed a glorious page in the history of aviation.